Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paweł Lewicki. I'm the Associate Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to another lecture in our virtual spring lecture series, Europe Today. Our guest lecturer today is Matthijs from Johns Hopkins University. Matthias is Associate Professor of International Political Economy at the School of Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University. He is also a Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he has served previously as the chair of the European Union Studies Associations from 2019 till 2021. Matthias' research focuses on the politics of economic crises, the role of economic ideas in economic policymaking, and the politics of regional integration. He is a co-editor of The Future of the Euro, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, and author of Ideas and Economic Crises in Britain from Attlee to Blair, 1945 till 2005, published at Routledge in 2011. Matthias has a very impressive list of publications, and his peer-reviewed articles were published in such academic journals, to name just a few, as Perspectives on Politics, Politics and Society, Review of International Political Economy, the Journal of Common Market Studies, Government and Opposition, the Journal of European Public Policy, the Journal of European Integration, Comparative European Politics. He has also written multiple articles and essays for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the Journal of Democracy, Survival and Current History. His currently working on a manuscript of a book that delves into the collapse of national elite consensus around European integration. The title of Matthias' lecture today is Forging Consensus in Crisis, Changing Macroeconomic Regimes and European Integration. Now, before I hand over to Matthias, I would like to say that you have the opportunity, and I would like to encourage you and invite you to pose questions. We will have a short Q&A round after Matthias' lecture for about 15 to 20 minutes. You can pose these questions through a Q&A box that you can see below in your Zoom application. And I will read and include these questions in the discussion after Matthias' lecture. So without further ado, I hand over to Matthias. Matthias, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak in the Europe Today series, which has many great colleagues and many great scholars. So it's an honor to be here. I've been to Pittsburgh a few times, and would have been nice to be there in person. But I'm coming back in early May for the European Union Studies Association, which will have its biennial meeting there in Pittsburgh, where many actually EU organizations, EU scholarly organizations are based. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about this book project that I've been working on, and it you know, as things go in academic careers, you have an initial idea based on what's going on in the news or going on in current events. And in my case, this started around 2016-17 during the Brexit referendum, during of course the rise and ascendancy of Donald Trump to the White House, and all kinds of other problems that were going on in the European Union. And it did seem to me that you know, what was really happening is that this elite consensus around European integration was unraveling. Right? What wasn't clear to me at the time was what would replace it. And I think now in 2023, so about 6-7 years later, I think that's becoming a lot more clear, and it's clear for multiple reasons, and that's the subject of what I want to try to talk about today. So let me share my screen. So I've called this talk "Forging Consensus in Crisis." Changing macroeconomic regimes and European integration, because it seems to me what we've been missing in studying European integration in the last 25 years or so is the kind of the bigger historical picture, not just historical geopolitical, which I'll talk about, but especially more broadly speaking, what I term here macroeconomic regimes, and I'll talk a bit more about that later as well, right? And so the starting point is, and I'll come back to this by conclusion today, is this idea very popular, very common, very often mentioned, this idea of Jean Monnet that said famously in his memoirs that Europe will be forged in crisis and will move forward and will be the kind of collective outcome of the solutions to those crises. And so what's annoyed me about that line is, of course, that, I mean, anybody who studies European integration closely, especially the last 15 years, there's crises all the time, right? I mean, there's constant moments of perceived crisis or real crisis or narrated or constructed crises. Sometimes they're at the member state level, sometimes at the EU level, but the EU always gets dragged in. And not all these crises lead to big changes, right? I mean, not always does Europe move forward. Just like I think in a national context, and you know, this is kind of a very apt week to be discussing this. Whenever there's financial turbulence, financial crises, or economic sort of turbulence, some of it goes away, some of it gets responded to, some of it gets tinkered with, and others then lead to kind of much bigger new settlements changes, regime changes, paradigm shifts of that nature, right? So what makes a crisis a critical juncture for the development of European integration is the question I want to explore with you today. So what am I going to do today in today's talk? So I'll give you a kind of a brief, stylized view, very much 39,000-foot picture of European integration and how it started and how it's been going. And it is a story of recurring crises and shifting paradigms, I think, from a kind of big structural point of view. I'll briefly talk about many of the existing explanations and the problem with the existing explanations, especially as they became popularized in the 1990s and the 2000s, that it assumed a very kind of sort of stable world economy and a relatively stable geopolitical climate, right? It was a kind of unique period. So then I move on to introduce a macro structural lens to the study of European integration. I'll talk about the macro regimes that kind of build the foundations of the big settlements around which European integration could function and move forward. I'll talk about the compatibility of the EU and the Eurozone with diverse growth models and how that's been questioned and how now they're trying to find a kind of way forward, and also address the return of geopolitics, right? How European integration kind of moved within the structure of a bipolar world, firstly, then a kind of brief episode of unipolarity to now a much more multipolar world, which also makes it much more political or geopolitical. I'm not going to talk too long about the decade of crises because I think most of these are familiar to you, but I will kind of emphasize how all these crises are part of the kind of exhaustion of the second macro regime, which then will explain the emergence of the third macro regime and the new EU that's emerging, right? And then what I saw as the main elite consensus collapse that Pavel already mentioned is that the big four G7 countries of the EU, UK, France, Italy, and Germany, during the last decade or so, the last 15 years, pointed in radically different directions in what they wanted out of European integration and how they thought the EU could move forward. Of course, the UK left, right? So that's the exit part. The loyalty to the second macro regime and so on, and the second paradigm of European integration came from Germany, and that's now quickly shifting thanks to the Zeitenwende, and already was underway before the invasion of Ukraine with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in France and Italy, that won different kinds of voice, more voice at the EU level versus more voice at the national level. And that's kind of the consensus, I think, that's emerging now around more EU sovereignty or strategic autonomy, open strategic autonomy. So I'll talk a bit about that before I conclude as well. Okay, that as a kind of brief outline of the talk. So, sorry, yes. So a brief sort of stylized history of European integration. The way I tend to think about this, having studied this for better of 20 years now since starting graduate school, is it is a story of recurring crises, right? So think about the 1950s, your kind of great leap forward in European integration, if you want, as a response to the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war austerity, out of which a new consensus emerged. The second paradigm, as I call it, the neoliberal settlement, then as a response to the great inflation, oil shocks, and the stagflation of the kind of long 1970s period, right? So well into the 1980s, that dealt with the response to it. And then more recently, the last kind of the long 20 teens, if you want, the great, that started with the Great Recession, and you could bookend with the global pandemic, and then followed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? Saw all kinds of crises of European integration that then I think gave rise to populism and protectionism, right? So these recurring crises were always the foreboding structural conditions for these shifting paradigms, right? The European Union, the European Economic Community, or the European coal and steel community, as we knew it in the 1950s, was part of an embedded liberal settlement that was liberalizing from an economic point of view, but very much put politics ahead of economics, in the sense that there were all kinds of safeguards. There was, political stability, and domestic demands of democracies always came before liberalization and market integration logic. The return of the market, a neoliberal settlement that started to emerge in 1983 with Mitterrand's U-turn, all the way, and its heyday really in the 1990s and 2000s, and kind of started to implode after the global financial crisis and euro crisis. And then the rise of populism and protectionism that has resulted in demands for more resiliency in supply chains and more EU sovereignty. In this was partially as a response to the Donald Trump presidency in the US, and now I think much more out of fear of further Russian aggression and the rise of China, and how to commonly deal with this as well. But next generation EU, the response to the pandemic, I think, is part of this growing EU solidarity, growing protectionism, growing EU building out further capacity with a bigger role for the European Commission as well. And then finally, I think what's often forgotten, especially I think when you talk to European student audiences, especially in Belgium where I grew up, that some of the international system is left out, right? It's kind of taken for granted. But I think sitting where I am now in Washington, D.C., this is a big part of the story, right? So the first embedded liberal paradigm was made possible because it was a Western European settlement, and it was part of the Western part of the Cold War, right? The Western Alliance. The Washington Consensus and the unipolar moment then, enabled this kind of neoliberal settlement and strengthened it. And then what we saw as a much more multipolar world, I usually put it at 2012, when the second Xi administration is inaugurated in Beijing. But you could put it slightly later or slightly earlier. You see the rapid rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and a much less engaged United States. This is not just a Trump phenomenon, right? This was clear under the Obama administration, that wanted to make a pivot to Asia, wanted to be less engaged with Europe, turbocharged under Trump. And of course, now we have this, at least temporary, it could last longer, we don't know, but because of the war in Ukraine and the Biden administration being very, Eurocentric in its personnel, being drawn back in, right? But if you paid attention to what someone like Ron DeSantis has been saying to Fox News this week, then you also know that a new administration, a Republican administration in 24 could be much less engaged again, much like Biden's predecessor. So what I have noticed in reading and teaching European integration theory and reading about it is that I mean, it continues to be a very thriving field of study, right? And so there are some geopolitical explanations, but that's especially the case early on, right? So European integration is a response to changing geopolitical realities or the importance of American support for integration early on. But if you think about most theories today, analyzing European integration through a kind of lens of ideas, institutions, and interests, whether it's a federal way of looking at it, a neo-functional way of looking at it, or a liberal intergovernmentalist way of looking at it, from the lens of comparative politics, of institution building, or international relations. Also, if you analyze EU governance, thinking governance approaches, historical institutions and rational choice, and social constructivism, a lot of these theories tend to build from the bottom up, right? So they start with interests, with institutional ideas, and then kind of try to explain whether it is interest groups and how they align and how they then influence national decision making, and then how national governments are bargaining at the EU level. They have a very kind of bottom up approach, and they tend to take the kind of more structural environment, whether it's the global macroeconomic world, the global financial world, or the global geopolitical climate, as relatively stable. Now, why is this? Well, because of the 1990s, right? Many of these theories were kind of put in place in the 1990s and 2000s. This was the decade where a lot of scholars were trying to explain the euro, were trying to explain the single market, were trying to explain enlargement, right? There was kind of so much activity from 1985 to 95 that a lot of scholars tried to explain these big movements. But they were also doing this at a time of, relative calm geopolitically, and frankly, at least in the Western economy, right, the kind of OECD world, a very stable macroeconomic climate. And so Mark Blythe, my former advisor at Hopkins, who's now at Brown and co-author multi times over, we pointed this out in an article for RIPE, for Review of International Political Economy in 2017, called Black Swans, Lame Ducks, and the Mystery of IPE's Missing Macroeconomy. And so what we were saying in there is that, why do we keep getting things wrong all the time? Why are we surprised when Trump comes to power, when Brexit happens? Why are we surprised with the global financial crisis? And saying, well, what we've forgotten about is a kind of broader macro structural lens. And so what we coin in that paper is the idea of macroeconomic regimes. And so we define it very simply. A macroeconomic regime is basically defined by the main target variable of a country's macroeconomic policy, right? So this could be low inflation, price stability. It could be high employment or low unemployment. It could be high growth, right? It could be industrial independence. It could be autonomy. It could be, any sort of goal that you can think of. That's the sustainability, right? Environmental sustainability could be the main driving force of a macroeconomic regime. The point is that once that target has been chosen, we say it necessarily shapes states' institutional choices, right? So a macro regime is the economic policy target that's embedded within then dedicated institutional complexes that are both generative of, but also contingent upon the production of those targets, right? So think of macro regimes as the hardware of capitalism. So the institutions that are there, central banks that pursue price stability, or fiscal arrangements and treasuries that pursue high growth or something like this. So this is the hardware upon which different software packages, and that's the policy target, and the ideas that underpin them are then run. And so you could say, well, have we not seen this before? Many explanations of the 1970s have taken as given some kind of exogenous shock. And so what we're trying to do, and what I'm trying to do today, and also in this book, is basically to say, well, the focus on macroeconomic regimes is actually an effort to try to endogenize change, right? That way, once you choose this regime, once you settle on it, and other countries, of course, become dependent on it as well, then very quickly, this becomes self-fulfilling, right? So that way we can not only explain the stagflation of the 70s, the global financial crisis of 2007-9, but also the current populist and anti-elite revolt in the West that we've seen is probably fizzling out somewhat. This was about international political economy as a field of study. My point is I think this can be applied to the process of European integration as well, right? So if you think of, to put this a bit more in a bit more, English language, if you want, what are we talking about? So think of the first macro regime, the post-war regime, the embedded liberal regime. The policy target was full employment or low unemployment, and the policy outcome comes were as follows. You had positive inflation, right? Not super high, but positive, high enough. Labor share of GDP was at historic highs. Corporate profits were low or stagnant. Inequality was low. Markets were mostly national. Trade unions were strong. Finance was weak and relatively immobile. Central banks were weak and politicized, and legislatures were strong. Mid-1980s, late 70s, mid-1980s, this gets replaced by macro regime 2. The shift is from full employment to price stability, right? Especially from a macro target. And the policy outcomes are, unsurprisingly, secular disinflation, lower inflation or deflation. Capital share of GDP gets to historic highs. Wages are low or stagnant. Inequality starts to rise. Markets start to globalize. Trade unions become weaker or weakened. Finance is strong and highly mobile. Central banks are very strong and independent, and legislatures are weak. The point is that it's out of the second macro regime, the policy outcomes, that the global financial crisis came out of this. The populist revolt in the West, Brexit, Trump, and the rest of it directly was results of this kind of structural macro regime. So what's emerging today, and this is something that's becoming clearer to me now and in the last few years, and wasn't that obvious in 2016, 2017 yet, is that the policy target is shifting again, right? We're less worried about having only price stability as the main goal. Inflation is definitely higher today, and we're trying to get it down. But the main policy target of many governments right now are to have sustainable or more equitable growth, right? To create more resilience in supply chains, to guarantee social stability. So this is in a way a response, a reaction to the flaws of the second macro regimes. And so what are the policy outcomes that we are starting to see? We see higher inflation. Of course, this is something that benefits debtors, right? Students with student loans, people with mortgages, right? That at least at fixed interest rates, that makes it easier to pay off those mortgages. And so this tends to hurt creditors. Labor share of GDP is slowly starting to rise again, not everywhere, but in many places, and business interests are under closer pressure. There are growing calls for self-sufficiency, for supply chain resilience, and increasing de facto trade protectionism, right? This was, of course, already visible before the pandemic, but the pandemic sort of turbocharged this. Right? Why are we not making our own masks? Why are we not making our own PPE? And why are we dependent on other countries to make this? And this, of course, now even more obvious in the green revolution and the switch towards renewables, right? Where countries are starting to realize they're too dependent on one country, in this case, China. What we also see is that international capital flows remain high, but they're no longer growing in the way they were growing in the 1990s and the 2000s. Also, the days of when I started teaching this stuff, where FDI was seen as a boon for an economy, is now much more subject to scrutiny. So FDI screening is on the rise. Markets remain globalized, but there's pressure to deglobalize and to decouple from China and, of course, from Russia. Trade unions are somewhat back in fashion. I wouldn't push too much on this, but at least the kind of heyday of saying they were bad is gone. We're much more aware that finance should be used to serve broader societal goals rather than narrow profit maximization. Central banks remain powerful, but the pressure is now on to use that power to fight climate change, to fight the pandemic, to fight inequality, and so on. So the narrow focus on price stability has shifted, and fiscal policy is used much more flexibly and strategically to stimulate demand and investment. And that's a big change in the last few years compared to, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, where this was not the case at all, right? So another piece of the puzzle here is then this compatibility of the European Union macro regime with the universe of national growth models. Right? This is work that I done with Alison Johnson at Oregon State, pictured on the screen. And so here, the point is, I mean, the main point of this chapter in a book on diminishing returns on growth models is that the Eurozone used to be compatible with all four growth models, right? And of course, this quadrant of stasis was the most problematic one from a political point of view, and that's where Italy was already in post Euro. But the point is that the rules of the Eurozone were flexible enough in the early 2000s, especially after the reform of the Stability and Growth back in 2005, to kind of enable different ways of growing, be it in a balanced way, in a domestic demand-led way, or an export-led growth way, as the basic distinction between North and South always was between those two, the upper right quadrant that dominated in Southern Europe and the lower left quadrant that dominated in Northern Europe, especially in Germany. So the point is that since the Euro crisis, the problem is that these rules were tightened, and the rules were only compatible with this kind of export-led growth model, which was problematic because it pushed many Euro members into this world of stasis. And so that's where I think the EU is now having to revisit this. On the one hand, more solidarity at the EU level, on the other hand, a more flexible approach to the rules. I'll come back to this. So that's one, right? Is the story of there's this new macro regime that needs a new settlement for European integration. There's the lack of compatibility from the previous regime with national growth models, which needs to be revisited. And then thirdly, there's the return of geopolitics in a much more multipolar world, right? So the European project, if you think of the Cold War days, from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson and so on, there was very strong US support for integration during the Cold War, right? Then you could say with Clinton and Bush in the middle, there was growing US ambivalence about European unity, right? It was more often than not seen as a competitor already. And then, of course, in the last 10, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, it's seen much more as a competitor, of course, especially during the Trump administration. But it's clear that even in the Biden administration, there's more economic tension there than there was before. So even that, a less reliable United States, a hostile Russia, and a kind of warmongering Russia that's back invading countries at Europe's borders, and then a much more authoritarian China make the structural push for a more dramatic change in the way the EU does integration all the more urgent, right? And so that's what's behind what's happening. And so if I think of the last decade of crises, right? The Eurozone debt crisis that saw the single currency under pressure, Russia's annexation of Crimea, and then of course in 2014 and then in 2022 invasion of the whole country, the refugee and the migration crisis, which really was a crisis of Schengen and of the single market, rule of law, a crisis of EU values, Brexit, a crisis of EU membership, and then Donald Trump's election was really a transatlantic alliance under pressure. I see all these crises as symptoms of the running out of steam of the previous macro regime 2, that came to a head in the last 10 years, that also then caused this kind of massive schism in the way national elites in the big four EU countries that have traditionally driven European integration, or at least without who it couldn't move forward, to move in very different direction, right? So the Eurozone debt crisis saw a kind of change in approach from on your screen from left to right, from a very kind of austerity and structural reform driven rules-based approach to a much more flexible interpretation of the rules under Juncker and Draghi. And then I think the shift under Lagarde and Scholz towards Scholz as finance minister and now as chancellor towards next generation EU and using the EU much more actively on the world stage. The crisis of Russian aggression, of course, repeated in 2022 and ongoing, right? So that stresses the geopolitical dimension of the EU. That's enabled the EU to put together sanctions packages. And these are the kinds of things that the Commission does, right? This is not negotiated with individual countries. The Commission is the power broker here. And that where I think it's also notable that von der Leyen has visited the White House much more often than her predecessors have, because the EU is seen as a player in its own right. The refugee crisis, that was really a crisis for border countries, right? But then because of Schengen and the free movement within the EU, became a problem for European integration. Excuse me, the rule of law crisis, ongoing, hardest one to fix. I'll come back to that in the conclusion. Brexit, a crisis of membership, but also of this kind of, absolutist view of the single market, right? That triggered it, that basically took away certain levers of policy, especially over immigration policy, from individual member states. And then finally, Trump's declaration, if you want, that the EU was an adversary of the United States or a competitor. And so it lost its kind of major sponsor in the world, which made it hard to come up with elite consensus along European integration, right? So in this chart, and this is kind of borrowing a little bit from Alan Milward's The European Rescue of the Nation State. So what you could frame this is the transition from macro regime 1, and that's the bottom the lower left quadrant of embedded liberalism, right, where the polity level remained mostly national, and the level of socio-political embeddedness remained very much on the embedding side. This was the post-war consensus. This is what Milward was talking about when he talked about the European rescue of the nation state, right? And so what we've seen is slowly a movement kind of counterclockwise from one to a kind of neoliberal world order that then at the EU level became at the supranational level, right? So the EU during macro regime 2, so starting in the late 80s and early 90s, was an EU of rules and of constraints. And so much more, rather than a rescue of the nation state, a caging, like kind of a limiting what states could do when it came to fiscal policy, to monetary policy, to trade policy, and so on. And so what I think we're slowly seeing is the end, the slow fizzling out, if you want, of this macro regime, and we're moving towards kind of more embedding supranational EU, where there's more EU discretion, and you see this on sanctions, on acting in the world. There's more EU solidarity, which we saw emerge with next generation EU, and I think this is also a more sustainable EU, even though it will breed its own problems. But so what I've shown you here in this 2x2 also basically gives you the diverging national elite views on the EU, right? So roughly speaking, you can put Italy in the embedded liberal box in number 1. You could put the UK in the neoliberal box, especially the Tories and the current conservative government. You could put Germany at a kind of Europe of rules and constraints box, and then this is really France's Europe, right? So in many ways, where I think we're moving, for better or worse, and this is not necessarily the case in the area of defense, right, but in the area of economic macro regimes, political economy, and so on. I think this is, for better or worse, becoming a more French Europe, the way the French traditionally thought about European integration. And of course, the fact that the UK has left and that the Germans had to make a dramatic shift in the way they approach world affairs. It is what's making this possible. So let me elaborate just a little bit on this. About 10 minutes in the 10 minutes that I have left. Right. So I basically, to think of those 4 cases, how since 2008 roughly, the big 4, right? So and the big 4, I mean, and again, didn't mean to exclude any country particularly, but Poland is of course weighing much more on European defense issues today. Clearly, Spain has a role to play, right? But so in thinking about this, I thought of, okay, which are the 4 G7 countries of the EU? back in 2008, at least, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Italy. These are all big economies with a big say over and maybe a quasi veto over the future of European integration. And so what you see is their response to the multiple crises, or the kind of the decline, if you want, of the effectiveness of the EU by 2010, is different responses, right? And so I borrow from Hirschman's Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, even though it's not by no means perfect the way I apply it. I have my own twist on this. So national elite responses to a decade of crises for the UK was one of exit from the supranational level. For the French elites, it was this idea of l'Europe qui protège, right? A Europe that protects, which Sarkozy has used, which of course Macron is using. So more voice at the EU level, right? For the EU level, this idea of strategic autonomy, of souveraineté. And in Italy, what I put in Salvini's term, Europa delle Nazioni. I mean, they happen to be in power right now, but it's actually something more widely shared among many Italian elites, is that there needs to be more discretion and more voice at the national level, because Italy doesn't have enough flexibility. It's too much within the straitjacket, and it's not working from its own growth models perspective, right? So, and then the one missing here, of course, is Germany, because they don't want exit or voice. They actually were very loyal to the previous settlement, right? It was working for them. So national elite responses to a decade of crises, Germany had showed a loyalty to the status quo, but that has been gradually changing, right? Merkel, this should have been 1 and 2, not 2 and 2. Merkel 1 and 2, so from 2005 through 2013, was already very different from Merkel 3 and 4, when she governed with the Social Democrats again and started to become much more flexible and more willing to give up sovereignty and to move towards a kind of more French position, right? So the traffic light coalition under Scholz with the Greens and the FDP, I think, is solidifying this shift, even though, you know, by no means it's complete, or they don't agree on everything. France wants more voice for the EU level. Macron talks about solidarity and flexibility, or souveraineté, and this builds on the unsuccessful efforts by Sarkozy and Hollande. So the point is that actually the national consensus, whether it's left or right, is closer together within national context than it is across the EU level. Italy wants more voice for the national level, right? This was already the case with Mario Draghi when he was prime minister, but this was also true for Renzi. It was true for other prime ministers, Conte, and now Giorgia Meloni. The need for fiscal flexibility and more investment, for more solidarity. The idea that the Italian growth model is incompatible with existing Eurozone rules. And so from Berlusconi to Renzi to Salvini, Meloni, they all agree on the need for more national discretion. And then the UK, well, there wasn't quite an elite consensus on this prior to the referendum, but once the referendum was held and 52% voted to leave the European Union, it became the elite consensus, almost the unspeakable, the unmentionable, right? Labour and Tories, they both supported the democratic choice of the British people. They may have wrangled about what exit looks like and what the future relationship should look like, but in the end, this is something that I think is now settled for you know, maybe a generation, but at least for 10 years. And so differences here. Theresa May's Brexit would have kept UK relatively close to the EU. Boris Johnson deal was a much harder Brexit with the EU at arm's length, break with the past. But you see under Sunak, he's already trying to kind of find a middle ground between those two. So COVID-19, I think the global pandemic was in a way too good a crisis to waste for the EU, because and you add to that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where you had the end of German loyalty to the previous EU consensus, right? So here, COVID, in a way, when it hit Europe, and I'm sure everybody remembers this, it was roughly early March 2020, right? Early mid-March 2020. Well, in a way, that was exactly 6 weeks after the UK had left the political institutions of the European Union, right? It would take another 11 months to negotiate the new free trade agreement, which came into effect on January 1, 2021, right, when COVID was well underway, right, when the vaccines started to come and so on. But it allowed the EU, without the UK, to have an EU response to it, not just when it came to vaccine buying, but also to, you know, beef up its strategic autonomy when it came to protecting its supply chains, when it came to responding to the pandemic, and then, of course, in a major way through Next Generation EU, through fiscal means of its own. In 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the end of German loyalty to the previous EU consensus, right? So a lot of its objections to spending more, to you know, doing more together when it came to energy policy, sanctions, things like this fell out. And so this allowed Europe to move very quickly after UK exit and the collapse of German loyalty to the previous consensus, to move into a kind of direction of more voice, either at the national and supranational level, which of course is what we've seen, right? So, is EU sovereignty this new paradigm? Is this time different? And I think it is, even though there's lots of problems with EU sovereignty, and we're at the beginning of this, right? But I think you can see, if you look at the May 2020 joint Franco-German declaration, everybody focused on number 2, the recovery fund of 500 billion euro financed by joint EU bond issues. That was a Rubicon cross. That was something that was taboo before. But if you look at points 1, 3, and 4, strategic health sovereignty through joint health strategies, speeding up both digital and green transitions, and enhancing EU economic and industrial resilience by giving new impulses to the single market and EU industrial policy. This is a much more goalless EU, right? This is not necessarily Hamilton, who's projected here, right? So the EU response to COVID-19, Next Generation EU, in the end ended up being close to 800 billion euro fund, more than half of it being grants, and this was fiscal redistribution from rich countries to poorer countries, right? Through the commission that was going to raise funds on the market, right? So, is this a Hamiltonian moment? Not necessarily, but is it the beginning of a much more resilient and capable commission that can act in times like this? I think that's absolutely the case. And then Germany's Zeitenwende that was made possible by the Traffic Light Coalition and Scholz's speech of February 27, 2022, about just over a year ago, did signify, right, a much closer alignment with European integration, of course, on the security side, very much under the American security umbrella, right? But nothing there, to be sure, is guaranteed to last, right? So it's very possible that in 2024, a new US administration may be less involved with Europe, that then will force Europe in a more closer integration direction, right? I think that's the path it's now on, and it's very hard to imagine going back to the status quo ante. So just a few more minutes, because I'm running out of time. We have about 15 minutes left in this session. So the European Commission prefers to talk about open strategic autonomy. It's also something that's preferred in the Netherlands and in Scandinavia and so on, because they don't want the EU to become a closed protectionist bloc. Strategic autonomy, often in the US, is laughed at because it's seen as, well, this means that the EU should have its own army and its own navy and its own air force and its own nuclear weapons and whatever it is, and it clearly that doesn't have that. And then sovereignty is something that, you know, they may not like in certain parts of the EU, but they very much like in France. So I think the strength is, and this is often the case with being lost in translation, right, is both open strategic autonomy and EU sovereignty mean different things to different people, elites, and to national electorates. But that, I think, can be a strength. Just like in the 1990s, the single market was the solution for everything. It was going to bring growth. It was going to lower inequality. It was going to increase competition, right? And so you could talk to business audiences or to labor union audiences or to national audiences and kind of show what the benefits were going to be of this. As my colleague at Hopkins, Nicolas Japko, pointed out in his book, Playing the Market of 2006. This is similar, I think, with sovereignty, right? For some, it means a closer military cooperation. For others, it means sanctions. For yet others, it means using the EU market in strategic ways to pursue its strategic goals, and so on. So the consensus emerging is that the EU needs to be able to act more autonomously to defend its interests in a multipolar world. I don't think that's being debated. What's being debated is how to do it and how to get there. But it does mean more power for the European Commission. And obviously fault lines remain, right? The north-south divisions are still there. They were clear when Next Generation EU was negotiated. I think the east-west fault line is very clear now as well, especially over the response to how the EU should respond to Ukraine, right? I mean, so far they've stayed united, but this is by no means guaranteed. Smaller versus large member states have different interests. And then the idea is, well, what about national sovereignty? And what does EU sovereignty mean? Is it compatible with national sovereignty? Because there's still national trade-offs and choices that different countries want to make differently. But there is an emerging consensus that problems like climate change, terrorism, global competition are much easier to solve as a bloc. So, in conclusion, the role of crisis in European integration is something that's very much overstudied, right, and maybe overdetermined. Right? Waltraud Schelkle at London School of Economics calls it Jean Monnet's curse. Right? It's the right question to ask is not do crises in Europe lead to further integration, but the right question to ask is a research question. Under what conditions do crises lead to quote unquote progress in European integration? And here, if you want to understand the big moves in European integration, the big bargains at the intergovernmental level, you can't take the geopolitical climate and the macro regimes for granted, right? That's something that if you do, you get these linear projections or you have a certain teleology in EU integration that's problematic. So all that said, I would call myself cautiously optimistic that this is proceeding and that this is moving in this direction and that this is probably more sustainable than the old consensus around the single market and the single currency that was much more narrowly conceived in narrow economic terms. But we have serious problems that remain. Right? There's a rule of law crisis in Poland and Hungary that's far from solved, and it's more problematic in Hungary than it is in Poland. Eurozone institution remain incomplete, right? I mean, and that's a question you have to ask yourself today with all the financial turbulence in the markets that are ongoing. If there's a new banking crisis, the EU still doesn't have common deposit insurance. It hasn't completed the capital markets union, and there's still a kind of fragmentation in the EU financial architecture and landscape that I think could be deeply problematic even for the coming days and weeks as the crisis of a single Silicon Valley Bank in the US and now Credit Suisse in Europe and other banks that are in trouble because of the higher interest rates and so on, that could play out. And on the security and defense apparatus, I'm probably more with the pessimists, right? I don't think you are going to see any common European defense unless, of course, there's a complete abdication of an American leadership role, and then they won't have a choice, right? But it still will be deeply problematic. It remains divided and underdeveloped. What is not underdivided and underdeveloped is the EU's capability to act in many other things when it comes to investment screening, when it comes to export controls, when it comes to using access to its market and trade in a strategic way, when it comes to sanctions, when it comes to buying weapons and financing weapons and sending them to conflict zones. That's all stuff we've seen in the last 2 years, in the last year really, and that's been extraordinary. So despite the serious problems, there's good reasons to believe that EU integration will go on and that greater EU sovereignty can serve as the new paradigm binding remaining EU states together. But like most paradigms, this one will have its flaws built into it, right? It will plant probably the roots for the next crisis in a few decades or in a decade or so, where there will be responses to it, and then maybe a new paradigm will emerge in this. So I tend to have a more cyclical view in that way of history than a kind of teleological kind of progress view that leads us all to a kind of common destination. All right, I think Pavel will probably forgive me for the few extra minutes, but let me stop my screen sharing here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Matthias. That was very rich. You talked a lot and a lot of content, and I'm trying to wrap my head around all that. Just, to invite others, I would like to invite others to, and our audience to pose questions. If you have these, feel free and to post them in the Q&A box. Now, I will start the conversation and get the ball rolling. In the series of lectures we had, there was no one who was speaking about what is going on right now from the integration perspective. So I really appreciate, this post-integration insights and how, the situation is much more complex and how this integration paradigm has run out of steam, but also your very nuanced, analysis into these very different actors and different dynamics. But, I'm an anthropologist and we're doing a lot of, interdisciplinary research at the European Studies Center at Pitt. And I wonder, how this, if you look at it from, cultural historical perspective, how this lack of steam in integration theory is just an outcome of, the fact that we just lack in today's ideologies or, thinking and philosophy lack the big theories. So what would you say about that?
It's an excellent question. I mean, EU studies, EU integration studies, especially the way it's been studied in political science, who's kind of taken ownership of this, because in the end, I mean, the beginning European integration was studied as economic integration, right? Just any other case, this was happening regionally, this was happening globally. But then, of course, the EU, I mean, you could hardly say you can compare it with Mercosur or NAFTA or ASEAN, right, or ECOWAS or any other kind of regional organization, because it has state-like elements, right? And so on the one hand, it's something you should be studying from a comparative political development point of view, right? Almost even you probably get more insights from the early American colonies and the 13 colonies and the American Confederation. Even though the problem is once you do that, then you think it's going to be the United States of Europe eventually. And there's just, these kind of roadblocks on the way, which again, like the 13 colonies were not sovereign states in the way that we think of France and Germany and Italy or Poland or something like this, right? But I think you're absolutely right in the sense that in the 90s and the 2000s, because we had, so many more statistical tools, and there was a kind of emphasis on, I mean, we lived in the end of history, right? And so the often misused phrase of Frank Fukuyama meant that the big debates were over, right? And so now it was just a question of how can these countries, move, to use an economic term, closer to the Pareto line, meaning where it was just a question of technocrats deciding what trade-offs were, what was efficient. And so, yeah, if it is more efficient because it gives you lower interest rates and lower inflation rates, why not join the euro? Why not have a single currency? I mean, it's from that point of view almost a no-brainer. And so much of our theories lack the complete cultural or historical lens, right? It was all seen from the kind of a bit of economics envy, right? In the sense that rational choices or kind of historical institutionalist approaches that, well, the institutions are in place and then they move very slowly and then, and so on. And now I think we had this populist moment where it was clear, right, that there was a backlash against technocrats running things. And you could say in many ways the Brexit vote was an anti-technocratic and a kind of populist revolt. I mean, often misunderstood and the lack of knowledge on the EU and poorly campaigned. And I mean, there's so many reasons why that vote happened the way it did. And that now, in many ways, I think social sciences are interested in these bigger questions again, right? I mean, it's hard because when I try to explain this to my students who are now, on average 20 years younger, it used to be very different. But when I try to explain to them what we assume, the assumptions we held about the world economy, about world politics, about geopolitical competition in 2005 were so radically different from today, right? I mean, people were lamenting the fact that the global financial crisis didn't mean the collapse of neoliberalism. I mean, especially on the left, of course. But of course, it was too early to tell, right? And so now you do get a sense that history is moving very fast. And yet, if you look at the bigger picture from a kind of narrower, okay, how is EU integration proceeding? I think it's also moving relatively fast because it is responding, it's doing things that were always thought of as the preserve of national authorities. Mm-hmm. And again, that doesn't mean I'm not arguing here that the EU should be doing more and states should be doing less, right? I think it's in the end, the test will be whether they can find a division of labor that's politically and democratically palatable, right? Because in the end, and that's in many ways, you see this in the United States as well, right? It's the reason why states' rights exist. And states' rights don't have to be a negative thing, right? It could mean that Massachusetts wants to do things differently from Mississippi, and that's what the voters want, and hence you respect that. If it becomes, we don't want to teach science anymore, and we want to exclude people from this and that, then it gets a very negative connotation. But in a way, is it legitimate when a country wants to, limit immigration, for example? It probably is, right? And you can't do that as part of the single market, at least not with other EU citizens. And that's something that the UK questioned, right? And many UK voters questioned, and I think politicians tapped into.
I think, this perspective of open strategic autonomy, and I like, that you just mentioned the United States, but also in some way could refer to China, and their economic development. I like that, you use the European example to help somehow develop that on one hand, but my question would be also, how that develops our thinking about integration. Integration is, this linear, is it a linear process or is it something different and more fuzzy? And, okay, but I have a question from one of our students. Is it possible for there to be more than one policy target within a macroeconomic regime? ? Or is there usually just one that is more prominent than most?
It's a good question, Jolie. I think there's always one that dominates, right? I mean, and it usually deals with the previous crises. I think we are definitely moving towards the primary target for the EU, for the US, for China, for Russia, for many countries is now to be autonomous, to be resilient, right? To keep good jobs at home, to much more willing to use industrial policy, right? Which is also striking because if you think of the UK, this was the worst possible time to be leaving the EU, right? Because there's so much of a premium now on being part of a bloc. The UK should have done this in the mid-1990s if they did this, when the world was liberalizing, when the world was, democratizing, right? And then it very much could have worked out a niche to be strategic about trade deals and things like this. Now it's clearly an economic own goal. But so you see that the main goal is price stability is no longer working, right? So the goal will have to be a broader one, probably to do with sustainability, with resilience, so a combination of those. And then you could see, other secondary goals as being part of this. The point is once a polity chooses its main target, what is it you're trying to achieve? That then all institutions, from the Treasury, from the central bank, from all the government departments, labor unions, and the way they think about their strategies, employer organizations, the way they start to basically game the system in a way to because they know this goal, right? The problem is once you choose a target, it becomes less effective as a target, and I think that's part of the pitfall in this discussion.
All right, Matthias, I'm sorry. It's the more you talk, the more I have more questions, and it's super interesting, and it's very thought-provoking lecture. So thank you very much for this. But we have come to our end, or to end of our time, and I'm sorry I have to interrupt here. Thank you so much for being with us and giving this super interesting lecture. For the audience and for anyone else, our lecture or this lecture, and as any other lecture in this lecture series, will be available on our webpage soon and on our YouTube channel. Our next speaker next week is Professor Reinhard Heinisch from University of Salzburg. And he will be talking about radical populism and its challenges to European democracy. I think Ingrid has posted this information in chat. Thank you once again. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And please join us for next interesting lectures on Europe Today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. Have a good day. Ciao.
Bye.